Hi everyone. Um, this video is for the Realism Antirealism track, and interestingly enough, for the first week of the distinct tracks, I'll be presenting via video if you didn't already know. Um, just to tell you, I'll be in Arizona at a conference. That's why I can't be with you at this time. So I decided to take advantage of modern technology and create this lecture a little bit beforehand. So this is my very first time doing a video lecture, so it'll be a new experience for me, and unfortunately it's a relatively primitive program, so I can't simultaneously present PowerPoints and draw or something like that, so I'll be relying on some more old-fashioned methods if need be, and mostly I'll just try to make this relatively brief and to the point, and hopefully you find it worthwhile, so bear with me. So for the Realism Anti-Realism track, we read a discussion that revolves around a distinction that reaches far and wide in philosophy. It's still relevant today. There's recent philosophers that have tried to employ it regarding moral properties. They say that moral properties, John McDowell famously says moral properties are secondary sorts of things, secondary qualities. So there's this primary secondary distinction that runs through the reading, and Dr. Patton discussed it, and as well as in the reading, so I assume some familiarity, and we'll just review quickly. Now normally, you know me, I would be asking all of you what this distinction is, but we don't have that opportunity, so instead I'll just write down some of the things that Galileo says. So he says that primary qualities are qualities of objects, right? That's this whole distinction. It's about the nature of things. So primary qualities are things like an object that are common to any sort of object, such as features like being bound, having some definite shape. Oh no, this Sharpie's dying already. Having definite shape, being in a specific location, and being extended. So I wrote these things down. And you have the benefit of stopping this at any time and reviewing if something's going too fast. And the Sharpie stinks, and I'm sorry for that. So hopefully this will help a little bit. So those are some of the things that are thought to be common of any object, independent of what we think about it. So these are features of the things themselves, is sometimes how it's thought of, or things that are entailed in any conception of an object, maybe, to make it a little bit more mind dependent in that second sense. So secondary qualities are supposed to be even more mind dependent, and so these will be things like color, like scent, like how we hear, right? So I'll write some of these down. So color, scent, what was another one? Like noise, volume, or something like that. Noisiness. This marker is basically already useless. So, right, these things are supposed to be features of objects that are dependent on our sense of these things. So without our particular sense faculties, there wouldn't be things like smell, like heat, maybe, the way the feeling, the phenomena of heat, maybe pain, right? These sorts of things aren't in the objects themselves. They only arise as a result of objects interacting with subjects, right? So it's some sort of relationship between the two that results in secondary properties. So for a character like Galileo, he's going to say that these sorts of things are not real in any robust sense. So for him, the real are, you might say, objective. And so I'm going to use another distinction here, and that is between objective and subjective. And objective means a lot of different things in different contexts, but in this context, objective means mind independent. So an objective fact is a fact that obtains independently of what anyone thinks about it. So a primary quality is supposed to be the sort of thing that exists even if there was no one to witness its existence, right? So if everyone on Earth disappeared at the same time, the Earth would retain its extension, right? It would still have a certain amount of space that it took up, we think, right? Whereas in the case of color, for example, if everybody ceased to exist, there wouldn't be red in terms of the experience of red that we have, right? So that necessarily depends on us in a certain way. So if a thing can't exist independent of us, then it doesn't exist objectively in this mind independent sense. And if it doesn't exist objectively, then it's not a real thing. So for Galileo, he'll say all these secondary qualities just aren't real. So you can see where this realism, anti-realism discussion is coming in to the fore. So all sorts of things like experience of pain in a certain sense isn't objective, right? There would be no experience of pain, there would be no experience of heat apart from some agents being able to experience these things. Right. And so there's a further problem, and this is brought up by Descartes to see the man return, that we have no good reason to think that secondary qualities resemble the real thing, the thing in itself, so to speak. So a natural thought might be that, well, certainly, my experience of something being hot or heavy or red isn't exactly like the real thing, but the real thing must somewhat be like what it is for something to be, hot, heavy, or red, or whatever, right? And then Descartes flatly objects to this line of thinking and says there's no reason to really think that those secondary qualities resemble the things themselves. And I think one way to put this into perspective that Blackburn does, it's a pretty intuitive move, is to say, so consider why we have our sensory faculties, right? So we have the ability to hear and to see, these sorts of things. Those faculties exist to facilitate our existence, right? So if you think that we evolved, or organisms of a certain sort, and the traits that we have, like having ears or something like that, were conducive to our survival or our ancestors' survival, and that's why we came about, you might think that the mark of whether or not we have a certain sensory faculty will be whether or not it helped us to survive. And if that's what it means to have a sensory faculty, and sensory faculties are what result in secondary qualities, then there's no necessary connection between a sensory faculty and what really is out there. Sensory faculties only work so far as they help us survive. And if for some strange reason we survive better as a result of perceiving things that weren't there or something like that, or perceiving things in a different way than they really are in themselves, then that's the way we'd be selected to perceive, right? So we have a lot of grounds for being skeptical about a wide range of secondary qualities. And I guess just to add to these sort of the sense of secondary qualities, these are some of the most important sorts of things in a lot of ways. A matter of our aesthetics, our personal enjoyment, our all sorts of things depend on what we think of as secondary qualities, right? So it's a deep puzzle. So this leads to a second or a further distinction. I guess this is the third distinction. And this is, again, something that's been discussed in class. And that is between the manifest. I'll try to keep these on the right side. The scientific and the manifest. Okay, this thing's done. That's the only one I have, and it's done. Between the scientific and the manifest. So the scientific and the manifest is supposed to have the same sort of divide as in the cases of primary qualities and objective things and scientific, right? So that's supposed to be on one sort of the divide, these sorts of things that exist independently of what we think about them, and then secondary qualities and subjective in terms of mind dependent. And the manifest. A further difference when you think of the manifest in particular is manifest, I've used this term before, but it's our phenomenal experience, right? So if you think back to impressions, it's in a certain sense similar to that. It's the way that we experience the world in the moment, right? So we live in a world where we see colors, where we hear sounds of a certain sort, and there's flavors. That's the manifest world, right? And so the scientific world is kind of peeling back all these unreal things and getting down to the core essence of reality, which consists of these thankfully still bold primary qualities. So, right. So this might lead to a certain sort of relativism about our sensory faculties. You might think that, oh, well, if our sensory faculties just kind of depend on, or the secondary qualities depend on our sensory faculties, then it's just a matter of each faculty. And this is what dictates what sort of secondary qualities there will be. It's not a matter of things in the world apart from us. It's a matter of what sort of sensory apparatus we have, right? And so you could definitely imagine, imagine what it's like to be a bee and perceive color, right? Imagine if they have any sort of internal world. There's something that it's like to see ultraviolet lights and to see the sort of landing strips on flowers that apparently is visible from the UV spectrum, and that's a different world, and that's dictated by the sensory apparatus that bees happen to have. And you could do the same sort of thought with other creatures like bats or dolphins, use echolocation, and this is a strange thought to us to imagine, right? So they perceive these sort of qualities, or they have this manifest world that is radically different from our own as a result of these distinct properties that are a result of their sensory apparatus. Yeah, and it seems like there's no clear grounds for saying which ones are right. Like, how are you going to say the way a bat echolocates is more correct or truer of the world than the way that we use vision to move about the world, right? So it doesn't seem like you don't have like a third perspective to look back on each case of our vision and bad echolocation and say, look, this one is just, as a matter of fact, better, right? So in another sense, humans are kind of locked in our perspective. We can't see other points of view and see how they perceive the world. The only kind of ground that you would have is something like survival, maybe how effective it is at performing its tasks, its biological functions, and at that point, this doesn't seem like it's getting at the truth anymore, right? It's just a matter of what's allowing us to survive best, what works. So it's completely imaginable that what allows us to survive best isn't a perfect view of the world that might be too detailed or too confusing, right? But rather a picture of the world that picks out certain relevant facts and ignores certain other sorts of states of affairs. That might be a better world for us to survive in. Right. So I've already covered this to some extent, but I guess a last point is that this distinction of primary and secondary qualities recurs. Locke is probably most famous. John Locke, an early modern philosopher, is probably most famous for this distinction. When people say primary, secondary, you tend to think of Locke before you think of Galileo. And yeah, one issue that you might have with these primary qualities is thinking about how you come to know them. So if you think of a thing like extension, right, some philosophers argue that all a primary quality is it's a quality which we can be aware of through multiple sensory faculties. So something that's extended is something that we can see, but it's also something that we can touch, right? If you touch a piece of granite, you can see that it's extended in space, but you can also like push on it. So two faculties corroborate this primary quality, whereas in the case of secondary qualities, this sense of taste can't be, made sure of by touching it or something like that. That would be a strange thought if you were to poke a cake to tell whether or not it's a good cake. I guess we say you can see a good cake, but that's metaphorical. So the question comes about as to what grounds we have for thinking that there are primary qualities, because the same sort of problems arise where we only think of primary qualities in terms of our ability to see these sorts of things in the world, right? The more we know about physics, you might think that something like extension or solidity isn't as clear-cut as you might think, right? So a solid object that you can hold and look at, it turns out as a matter of modern physics, is almost completely composed of vacant space, right? Like the distance between the electrons and the nucleus is vast, right? So it suffers from the same sort of problems. It's a matter of our sense impression that we can know any of these things. So this might make us worry that primary qualities are just as subject to the worry that they're a product of our faculties, of our ability to sense and feel and those sorts of things, as secondary qualities. And so this is the section I'm referring to at this point is George Berkeley's problems, that discussion. And then the second problem that I'm looking at my notes because I forget the second problem. So this is an interesting idea that Berkeley brings up, is that you can't imagine an object without its secondary qualities, right? So what it is to be an object is a thing that consists of these sort of qualities, right? So imagine a cake, right? And now take away its color, take away the way you would think it would taste, take away the texture, the weightiness, and what do you have? You have this sort of abstract idea of like, well, maybe it would still kind of sit in space, but it seems like when you're thinking of an object, the only way you know it is as a result of this collection of impressions, so to speak, right? To invoke Hume. So it seems that there's a slide from initially just objecting to secondary qualities to then ultimately being worried about primary qualities as well as secondary qualities. and there might not be as clear of a distinction between the two as we initially thought. And so one last note, a good way to show that you've learned to your family is, they'll ask you what you did over break, and you'll see why this is relevant in a second. They'll say, so what have you learned? And you'll tell them, or you could tell them if you were to wish, I took a philosophy class, and some smarmy relative of yours will be like, oh, what did you study? If a tree falls in a forest, does it make a sound? And you can laugh, right? Because that's kind of a pseudo philosophical question, although it's interesting, right? But you have the distinctions and the concepts at hand to address this question and take it seriously. So if a tree falls in a forest, does it make a sound? Well, you can respond and say, it depends on what you mean by make a sound. And what you're going to do is you'll invoke the primary secondary quality distinction. So if what you mean by sound is the primary quality of maybe like wavelengths, right, moving through extended in space or something like that, then it seems like if no one's around to hear it, a tree does make a sound, right? Because it'll still fall over, and then wavelengths will be emitted, presumably, and that phenomena is still occurring irrespective of anybody's around, right? So that you might say that's a primary quality, that it emits these wavelengths, right? But if you mean sound as in sense of sound, the phenomenal experience of a noise, then you'd say, well, if nobody's around to experience the secondary quality, then there was no sound. So now you can answer, if a tree falls in the woods and nobody's around, does it make a sound? You can answer that question employing the primary secondary question distinction. So I hope that wasn't too terrible, and this was a little disorienting for me as well because it was a new experience. So thanks, and I'm probably going to ask that question about the tree falling in the forest next week. So keep that in mind, and thanks for bearing with me for this whole time.